Hey y'all, how are you doing? If you want to learn how to make your own actually good builds in Minecraft, here's a one-stop shop of general knowledge that you probably want to know. The first thing I ever worry about in a build is the general shape. I usually plan out the general shape of the build using wool or concrete, sometimes even before I know what I'm going to be building. What you're looking for in a good shape is a lot of variation. So on the front wall, for example, I like to have some walls closer to you and some walls farther away. I typically like to have the most important part of the build closest to you. This will typically be the doorway or something like that, but it doesn't always have to be like this. The same rule also applies to the roof. I like to vary the height of different portions of my roof just to break it up and add a bit more interest up there. If you don't do this, your build can start looking a bit flat, and it's best to avoid it. Planning out the shape though isn't that hard. I typically try and stick with rectangles or square shapes, just because those are the easiest to decorate later. When I'm deciding what blocks I want to use on the build, I like to build a test wall. Some people like to organize their blocks in a grid or a row, but I find making them into a small wall first helps me test the blocks together to see if they actually work well. This way I can see what mood they create together better, and I can also see which blocks I'm going to use where. When I'm picking block colors, I tend to try and pick one base color and one accent color. It's easier to see this on a build that I made with some friends a bit ago. In this case, the base color will be the main stone brick mixture that we used for the pillars and the body, and the accent color is going to be the green prismarine that we used for the roof and some of the detailing. I try to make the accent color a bit more colorful than the base color, just so that it stands out a bit more. I also use it more sparingly than the base color. This though is just an overall set of guidelines. For example, on this build I'm working on now, base colors are the white section and the gray section on the bottom, and the accent color is the dark oak I'm using for detail. I'm using two different colors as base colors here, just because I wanted to section off the build a bit more. Feel free to experiment and see what looks best. Another thing that you'll want to know about is framing. Framing is the bits that you put around the corners of the build to help outline the shape. You'll see that a lot of people do this in their builds, and they tend to do it in different ways. For example, on this build, I'm outlining it with dark oak logs. And also, I'm making the framing a bit wider around the corners on this one. I wouldn't suggest doing this much with the framing when you're just starting out, but I do suggest to try and get creative with it. It is good to mention though that you won't be seeing framing on every build. Most of my builds have framing on it just because I like how it looks, but a lot of builds won't. For example, if you're going for a more simplistic look for your build, you will tend to exclude it, or if you're trying not to over detail your build, you might exclude it on certain parts. If you're ever in doubt though, adding the frame to your build can be an easy way to add a bit more detail to your build. Detail is what brings life to your builds. For example, in the house we're working on right now, it still really just looks like a shell. And that's because we haven't added any windows or supports to it yet. Be careful when detailing your build though, because it does go on a spectrum. What you'll see a lot of beginners do is they'll either fall on the side of over detailing or under detailing, and it's really hard to get the perfect balance in between. Over detailing is a problem that I used to face, and it's because I had a fear of leaving a blank space on the build. I would try and fill the entire build with a ton of stuff so that you could barely see the plain wall underneath. When I'm detailing my build, I try and put the most detail in the spots that are most important. So like I said earlier, the doorway, or if you have a main focal point like a statue on your build, you'd put it there. And as you get farther from that most important point, put less and less detail. This will help you channel viewers' eyes into the most important point of the build, which is where you want them. One issue that some people have is if they have a large portion of wall that they want to detail, they might struggle to figure out what to put there. This problem can actually be fixed with framing. If you're struggling to fit something into a large area, just split the area up into smaller sections. This will help it look better by simply splitting up the area, which adds detail in of itself, and it tends to be easier to put detail into smaller areas rather than larger areas. Another thing to keep in mind is to try and avoid repetitive looks. So for example, on this build, I have a lot of windows and support beams. And to avoid having this look too repetitive, I tried to mix up the patterns that the beams and windows were arranged in. This just keeps everything from looking too samey and will help your build from not looking too lazy. Another thing you'll want to get used to is the size of build that you like making. For example, most of my builds are typically in a pretty large scale, whereas a lot of people like building in smaller scales. There isn't that much of a difference in how these builds look, but on a larger build you can tend to add a bit more detail than on a smaller build. Since I don't have that many small builds of my own, here's a really good small scale build made by my friend Airtug. As you can see, the builds we both did are both houses, except the only thing is that he's using less blocks in his house. This kind of build would work a lot better in a survival world, and also has a bit more of a simplistic look than the one I'm building now. Like I said earlier, it really doesn't matter the scale of build you like building in, it's really just preference. It isn't uncommon to see people bragging about the size of their builds, but I would want to encourage you to not get caught up in that, because it doesn't matter what size your build is, it's how you use it. One thing that I want to see people focus more on is the background for their build. It isn't uncommon to see people building in a super flat world or with a gray concrete background to their build. I see people with the gray backgrounds a lot on places like Instagram, and to be honest, it does get kind of boring seeing it so much. I want to see people putting their builds into more of an environment area. And I'm not saying you have to go all out like I'm doing right now, you only have to do a little bit to your build. Like let's say you're building a house for your survival world, make an area for a little garden around it, or maybe put a fence around it. What I personally like doing is making some custom trees and surrounding the build with those. This blocks the line of sight of the viewer so they can't see out into the super flat world you're building in. For this build, since it's a medieval style Tudor house, I'm putting it into a naturey forested area. I'm also going to lead a path from out the door and to outside of the build area. This just gives the outside a bit more detail than it would have otherwise. I will suggest though, don't put too much detail into your background area because it's not the main thing that people should be focusing on. People should be focusing on the actual structure that you made. The lack of detail doesn't mean to make it look intentionally bad, it just means that you're not putting as much there. Now while I'm having these cinematic shots playing in the background, let's talk about the mood of builds. When I'm building, I like to have some sort of emotion in my mind for the build to have. And then while I'm building, whenever I make a decision about what kind of shape the build's gonna have, or what I'm gonna do for the detailing, I always make sure that it fits with the mood of the build. For example, for this build, I wanted it to have some sort of calm feeling to it. That's why for the background, I decided to put a calm river running through the area. I also made sure I didn't make the build too imposing or too tall or anything like that. But it is important to keep this in mind because it gives your build just that extra bit of character. Anyways y'all, I hope you enjoyed. If watching this video made you really want to build something, you can click this video here. I'm not sure what it is, but it might give you some inspiration for what to build next.